Good evening. By circumstance, the title of this lecture carries the name of probably my best friend, and certainly the mentor in my career who has mattered most. And I thought it would be most fun for this audience if I use my talk to speak about Roger's career and its relation to my career. I was a junior at Caltech when I came to Scripps for the first time in the summer of '39, for the reason that I had a girlfriend at Scripps College and she was going to spend her summer with her grandparents in La Jolla, and I needed a job so I could date her. The slide shows a beautiful photograph of a dilapidated pier and some buildings needing badly repairs. And at that time, in 1939, shows the new ship we had just received, the E.W. Scripps, a sailing schooner, as a gift from the Scripps family. The faculty at Scripps, when I came, consisted of 15 people, including the janitor and the director. Today there are 16,000. Very different place. The director was Harold Sverdrup, S-V-E-R-D-R-U-P, who had been a student at the Bjerknes School in Bergen in hydrodynamics. And Bjerknes had offered him the incredible honor of becoming a member of the teaching staff of the Bjerknes School, when the Norwegian explorer Amundsen invited Sverdrup to become his science leader aboard the ship Maud to go into the Arctic for 3 years and make some observations. Amundsen decided, wonderfully I think, that he needed some real field experiment and went with the Maud, into the Arctic. For 3 years, they got stuck in the ice and didn't come back for 7 years. It's curious that the Maud, the same vessel as you see in the slide, remained in the Arctic for many years. It's just now been recovered and is sailing back to Oslo for the 100-year anniversary later this year, and Mary and I hope to go and come aboard when she returns to Oslo. Roger Revelle had graduated 3 years before I came down in 1937 in marine geology. And Harold Sverdrup assigned me a cluttered desk in the old library and gave me some observations, some data that had been taken by the first expedition of the E.W. Scripps, with Roger Revelle in charge. The expedition led with all sorts of observations in the Gulf of Baja California. The desk was utterly cluttered. I had no idea whose stuff it was. And the third night, at sitting there, a man came by, that was Roger, asked what I was doing at this desk, and started telling me about his observations and we talked half the night before he quit. Typical of what I was to find from Roger all his life, always late, always unexpected, but always time for people to talk to. Sverre turned over to me a pile of data with no explanation of internal tides in the Gulf of California, saying, see what you can make sense out of those. That's quite a challenge. Later that summer, Roger went out on the, this is a picture of the ship in the Gulf that I've just mentioned, but on the next slide, you see Roger aboard the board, and I was invited to participate, and it was my first sea trip, and under the leadership of Roger. The purpose of the trip where I went out was to measure currents in various places in the Gulf using an Aikman current meter. How many in this audience have ever seen an Aikman current meter? Please. I will ask the man who introduced me to give a talk on those. It was introduced before the turn of the century, and it has little balls falling into compartments of various directions for the last 30 turns of the propeller, and it didn't work. And Roger worked all night between dinner and breakfast to make the balls fall into the appropriate directional department. And I mention that because it's typical of his entire career that somehow or another he made things work, no matter how long it took. I had such a good time at that first summer that next year I was back to ask Harald Sverre whether he would take me as his student. At that time, only people who got jobs in oceanography were at Scripps, Woods Hole, and Davis. There were no other jobs. And I guess Sverre was thinking hard were somebody would retire during the next 10 years. And there were 10 seconds of silence. And I quickly said, I'll take it. And that was the beginning of my lifelong career as an oceanographer. This was the year when most of Europe was occupied, and my country had been occupied by the Axis power. So had Norway, and so had some of other countries. England was being bombed, and the Axis submarines were sinking Allied shipping almost at will. And it was decided to build a laboratory under Roger's heading at Point Loma. The left picture shows Roger being made a Lieutenant JG in the US Navy, junior grade, where he was to serve for the next 7 or 8 years. The right picture shows me in ski troops at Mount Rainier. I decided that times were so dim that I wanted to be involved in the war and joined the US Army on the Mount Rainier ski troops. Sometimes later, Roger formed the radio sound laboratory. And I must tell you that after 18 months of service in peacetime, learning mostly, listening to lectures on whom to salute and whom not to, I was delighted when Roger Revelle and Harald Sverdrup asked for my discharge so that I could work in the laboratory with them on mostly anti-submarine warfare problems. I drove back from Mount Rainier to join the activity, and 1 week later, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, and all discharges and leaves were canceled, and my battery was sent to New Guinea, where it fought a very difficult battle against the Japanese and was essentially wiped out. Well, so that was my early oceanographic history. And something happened at the time I will just mention. You see, Scripps was a marine biological station, and Harald Sverdrup had decided that it should be modified to an oceanographic institute. And there was some jealousy among the faculty when this happened. And as it turned out, years later, a sad story, that two of the Scripps faculty members had turned Harald Sverdrup over to the CIA, and his clearance was canceled. And he had to give up his job of helping with anti-submarine warfare at Point Loma. And as a result of that, I quit the job and went to work for the Pentagon, where my clearance apparently was okay. And soon after I arrived at the Pentagon, I learned of a forthcoming plan for having an amphibious landings at the northwest coast of Africa in the coming winter. And I attended some practice landings in South Carolina. And whenever the waves, they used a landing craft called LCVP, Landing Craft Vehicle and Personnel. And you've seen pictures of those. They move into the beach and lower the bow, and people jump out and run ashore. But whenever the waves broke at something like 5 feet or higher, the craft would broach parallel to shore. Waves would break into the landing craft. People get hurt, and the practice landings would be postponed for a better day. So I came home wondering how serious that was, looked at the very, very little literature there was about landing in Northwest Africa, and found that the average wave height in winter was exceeding 6 feet, and wondered what would happen. And when I was very young, totally inexperienced, went to my commanding officer and said, I think the only chance we have is to learn to predict waves so we could pick 2 good days for the landings. And he said, Munk, go back to what you're told. And they must have thought about that. Well, as it turned out, there had been no they. And in my despair, I telephoned Sverdrup in San Diego. He flew out on the next DC-3. At that time, it took 3 landings to fly from San Diego to Washington. And we sat down for a month and decided what it would take to make wave predictions from weather maps. And the amazing thing is, and I really believe that to be true, that no one had attempted to predict waves prior to that time. Well, we decided that the method should be broken into 3 categories. You see them on the slide. The slide is now working, isn't it? Yes. Sea swell surf. Sea relates the height and period of waves in the storm area to the wind speed and fetch. Swell is the physics of the distance, possibly quite long, between storm and landing beaches. And surf, the most difficult of the problems, the modification of the waves in the shallow water. And we decided after a month that it could be done, even though it had not been done. I'd like to say briefly that we were desperate to find a way of checking our calculations of prediction. And we found that Pan American Airlines had kept using amphibious planes in the Azores, had kept books on the dimensions of waves for the past. And we went to some historical weather maps and checked our predictions against the Pan American Airline records of classical waves. And we found that our predictions were fair, pretty good, except once in a while, the observed waves were much higher than we had predicted. But curiously enough, these once in a while were at strangely spaced, even time intervals. And on further examination, it was found that they invariably happened on Saturday night. And we made the policy decision that the high waves were due to Portuguese wines rather than to high winds. And the method was used for the prediction, and it worked quite well, landings. We were then authorized by the powers that be to have classes in San Diego for meteorologic officers of the Navy and Army it was at the time, to teach them weather prediction and use those wave predictions in the Pacific Theater War. And Sverdrup and I taught monthly classes to about 12 officers each time for a year, and graduated about 100 people who had some experience with waves. And I can assure you that we learned more from our students than they learned from us. We had to rewrite our wave prediction every time, every month for every new class. Well, the thing I would like to leave this audience is the astounding number that 2.5 years later, after Pearl Harbor, 2.5 years late, we, the Allies, landed 150,000 troops in Normandy. On the first day, of the landings. It seemed almost impossible 2.5 years earlier when we started that anything could be done. And my feeling of great hope for the future with climate is left with that when you work together on a problem somewhat well-defined, it's just remarkable what can be done. I like to show the next slide because it's a matter of great pride. And the reason I got the award here day before yesterday, written by Blair Kinsman, who wrote one of the good books on waves. On the next slide, at that time, I want to show that Roger Revelle was started ONR. I was appointed assistant professor at Scripps, and I'd been at Scripps all my life, as you have mentioned, and received the appointment of a Secretary of the Navy chair, which I've held for 35 years. Two interesting things that I was involved in and Roger was involved in are the nuclear bomb tests. In 1946, we went to Bikini to test an atomic bomb at the lagoon in Bikini, one airborne and one waterborne. And I want to leave with you the impression that I really regret this incident all these years later. The US Navy came in one morning, informed the 150 natives of Bikini that they had to leave the island that night because of the forthcoming bomb test. Attempts were made to evacuate these families to similar islands, but didn't really work out. And they never found an adequate home ever since. It was a wonderful time, though, to participate in these tests. We met the King of Tonga at the time, and he came to visit us in San Diego. I must tell you one story. When the King of Tonga was at our house with Roger Revelle, and he had to catch a flight in Los Angeles. So Roger said, I will drive you back. Now Roger and the King of Tonga looked alike, both 6'5", big, tall, strong, heavy, fat people. Anyhow, Roger drove them, was caught speeding by the police between San Diego and Los Angeles. And the police turned to Roger and said, who are you? And Roger said proudly, I am the director of the Scripps Institution of Oceanography. And the policeman said, oh yeah, and who are you? He said, I'm the King of Tonga. And my gosh, they got away without a ticket. Well, anyhow, in the next slide, I want to show that we had a second such test at a WETARC only 6 years later. You must remember that the capacity of the Bikini and any WETARC test is 1,000 to 1. One is nuclear, one is a hydrogen bomb. A fantastic difference. It was built at a time when rumors had it that the Germans were very close to it. And a fantastic story to succeed. One man, one morning, if I may tell you, in Roger's office, who had been appointed of director of Scripps by that time, a Navy captain appeared and questioned us about the bathymetry in the vicinity of Eniwetok at some length of time. But Eniwetok is an aseismic area, no earthquakes. And I asked the captain, said, why was he so interested in that bathymetry? And the captain said, because it has going to have a magnitude 7 earthquake. We said, well, how do you base that on the fact that it's a non-seismic area? And he said, the probability of a magnitude 7 at Eniwetok is 1. That was the first indication that we were going to test an H-bomb on any of the islands. After the H-bomb test at Eniwetok, we went home for 9 months on Operation Capricorn. That was 1952, and Cousteau had just invented or patented his diving suit. And we all had bought Cousteau's diving suits and spent 9 months going home, diving almost every day in the South Pacific. And I want to leave with you the impression that that was the time when the theory of geology changed fundamentally from a belief in continental drift to plate tectonics. And none of you know probably about how much of a change it was, but it was a first order difference in interpreting the distribution of oceans and continents. And the thought I want to leave with you is that what happened is that the young people were convinced by the new data that was taken, partly by our group going home, data on radioactivity of the continent and the heat flow through the sea floor, et cetera, et cetera. But most of the classical geologists did not change their mind, but they died, and the younger ones who took their positions took the new position. It's very funny, not too many people really change their mind once they have decided on fundamental principles just because of a few new observations. But the new ones eventually take over. The next slide then shows us going home from Capricorn, the very people who took much of the data that caused that revolution in marine geophysics. And I guess I show a slide of passing the equator. Now, the next and final really new adventure of this sort came in 1953 when we had the so-called Morehole expedition. Morehole was the attempt to drill to the mantle of the Earth directly to get a sample of what it was like. And it was a very important problem of geology to decide that. And we still haven't reached the mantle of the Earth. The Japanese tried it and failed. On this picture, you see Steinbeck, who was the famous author who went with us on the Morro project, and we drilled off Guadalupe Island, south of San Diego, and we learned in stage 1 of Morro project, and we learned how to keep the drilling vessel on station while we're drilling, which had not been solved before. It's done by having a acoustic positioning system locating the vessel relative to 3 points on the seafloor, and is still basically the way in which you keep drilling vessels in the deep sea on position. But the next step of actually drilling to Morro failed and has still failed and remains to be achieved. Next slide. I show this slide of Roger talking to a roughneck at the time we were learning how to drill through the deep sea floor. And you notice Roger is completely absorbed in trying to explain to the roughneck of the theory behind drilling to the mantle. And as always, although there are probably important things to be done, he takes his time completely in trying to answer and discuss the question of anybody, any student, any colleague, any worker on the project. It's his great, great strength. Roger decided at the time that you cannot have an oceanographic institute reach its full strength unless you have a nearby associated university to worry about the fundamental science. And Woods Hole had come to the same conclusion. Woods Hole made a strong attachment to MIT at the time to bring this about. And Roger fought for a San Diego campus for the University of California. And there was a bitter fight. He was at that time director of Scripps, and he fought the chairman of the board of the Regents. Roger's view was that we should have sort of a state equivalent to Caltech, teaching mostly graduate courses, and a high technical campus. Our regents believed we should have a very good football team and wanted it located in downtown San Diego. The two views were incompatible, and Roger lost, and lost what had been the expected fact that he would be the first chancellor of the UCSD campus. So Roger eventually left for Harvard, where he was asked to found a population center. Yes, and I wanted to tell you that while he was trying very, very hard to start a graduate campus at San Diego in technologically oriented, I lived on the campus, very near the campus, have a rather elegant house that some of you have seen. And he would bring people who we tried to recruit to our house, usually at sunset time. And the martinis were ready on demand. And he said, here is a typical, you see, there's the residence or something. And I remember when he got Harold Urey, Nobel laureate, to agree to come and start our new campus. Anyway, he left for 20 years for Harvard, did a very good job on the population center there, and eventually came home. And at that time, he became, if you recall, between the times when he started to when he ended the population center, the population of the planet Earth increased from 3 billion people to, I think, 8 billion. And he became convinced that the population problem is part of the climate problem, and that we should limit the population to something affordable, manageable, as part of such a program. And I want to mention that it's not generally considered part of it, but he believed strongly that it ought to be. And I'm coming to the end of my story, a late picture between Roger and I. At that time, you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, very kindly, that the so-called Heard Island experiment, which I'm very proud of. And we needed permission from NOAA to do the experiment. It was an experiment to see whether you could transmit over very long ranges. And we thought we could do it at a reasonable intensity so as not to harm marine life. And on that basis, requested permission from NOAA to do so. And NOAA generally opposed it, so we eventually carried it out. And when I first went to NOAA, who had been a student of both Roger and myself, before I became director of NOAA, Roger was sitting in the audience. He had by then troubles walking, like I do. He had walked, you must know the building, the Constitution Avenue, miles-long alleys, with his cane. And when I went there to plead our experiment, he was sitting there quietly, by his very presence, giving his support to what we were trying to do. Well, I'm coming to the end of my story, but I hope you have a touch of the independence of this great man. My wife, Judy, made that sculpture of Roger and his grandson very late in life. And it carries on it the description. Can you read that? This task was done with more enthusiasm than knowledge. And I'm afraid that is the principle of my career as well. I've done all sorts of things with more enthusiasm, knowledge, and I'm delighted to take questions. I hope I didn't take too long.